while Israel is bombing hospitals and schools and churches and mosques and other civilian areas, the United States is using its power at the United Nations to prevent calls for a ceasefire, to prevent peace. Now, this has happened on 2 different occasions in just 1 week. So at the United Nations, on the 16th of October, the Security Council blocked a call for a ceasefire that was proposed by Russia. And I'm reading here from the official United Nations news outlet, which is UN News. And it noted that the UN Security Council failed to adopt a resolution proposed by Russia that would have called for a humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. And what did the voting look like? Well, it was the Western colonial powers in Japan in support of Israel and its war crimes, and it was the global South either calling for a ceasefire or at least abstaining. So there are 15 members of the UN Security Council. 5 of them voted for the ceasefire. That was China, Gabon, Mozambique, Russia, and the UAE. They voted for the ceasefire, and 4 countries voted against the ceasefire, including France, Japan, the UK, and the US. Of course, the colonial powers that have a history of committing genocide and ethnic cleansing. And of course, the US and the UK and France have permanent seats on the UN Security Council, which gives them veto power. And then there were 6 countries that abstained, which were Albania, Brazil, Ecuador, Ghana, Malta, and Switzerland. Now, the reason Brazil abstained is because Brazil had its own proposal that went to the UN Security Council 2 days later, and the US vetoed that proposal as well. Here is another report from the UN news agency, and the headline is very clear. US vetoes Security Council resolution. UN News wrote clearly that the United States vetoed a UN Security Council resolution that would have called for humanitarian pauses to deliver life-saving aid to millions in Gaza. Now, in this case, there were 12 countries that voted in support of this resolution on the 18th of October. That was 2 days later. This resolution was proposed by Brazil, and instead of calling for an immediate ceasefire, it called for humanitarian pauses. So it was a weaker resolution, but it was a resolution that was trying to bring about peace. And the countries that voted in support of it were Albania, Brazil, China, Ecuador, France, Gabon, Ghana, Japan, Malta, Mozambique, Switzerland, and the UAE. There was 1 country that voted against this resolution, which once again was the United States. This is the definition of being a rogue state. The US is going against all other countries on earth, basically, and supporting more war and opposing peace, opposing humanitarian pauses. And there were 2 countries that abstained. The UK, of course, a close ally of the US that also supports Israeli war crimes, and Russia abstained. However, Russia abstained because it complained that the resolution was too weak, and instead, Russia had said that it proposed 2 amendments calling for an immediate, durable, and full ceasefire, and also it called for the end to attacks on civilians. Those amendments were opposed, again, because of the US. So even though Russia abstained, it abstained because they said this resolution was too weak. And the Russian ambassador to the UN said that this second proposal had, quote, no clear call for a ceasefire and will not help to stop the bloodshed. That's why Russia proposed amendments calling for an end to indiscriminate attacks on civilians and infrastructure in Gaza, and condemned the Israeli imposition of the blockade and called for a new humanitarian ceasefire. These were measures that were called for in the previous UN Security Council resolution proposed on the 16th of October by Russia. Again, that's the resolution that the Western colonial powers voted down. And in response, Russia's ambassador to the UN blamed the, quote, selfish intention of the Western bloc. He said that Western countries basically stomped on global hopes for peace to bring an end to the violence. And of course, you know, the U.S. blamed Hamas, and as always, and said Israel has the right to supposedly defend itself, which it's not doing, actually. UN experts and human rights experts have said that Israel is committing war crimes. It is not in any way defending itself by imposing a complete medieval-style siege on Gaza. And what's not that well known by people in the West is that Palestine is not a member officially of the United Nations, but it is an observer state at the United Nations. So Palestine has a representative at the UN, and he said very clearly that what is happening in Gaza is not a military operation, but a full-scale assault against the Palestinian people and a massacre of innocent civilians. He said, quote, "Nowhere is safe in Gaza. Families embrace every night, not knowing if it is for the last time." And he said, he told the UN Security Council, quote, "Do not send the signals that Palestinian lives do not matter." 138 out of the 193 members of the United Nations officially recognize Palestine as a state, and they represent the vast majority of the world population. In fact, if you look at a map of the countries that officially recognize Palestine, you can see that it's the global south countries plus Russia, and it's the Western colonialist countries that refuse to recognize Palestine, even though they hypocritically constantly claim they want a two-state solution. They actually have done nothing to support a two-state solution and have actually continued supporting the Israeli apartheid regime as it colonizes more and more Palestinian land, stealing more and more Palestinian land. So never forget this ridiculous hypocrisy when Western governments talk about international law or human rights. They're going against the will of the vast majority of the actual international community, representing the vast majority of the world population, which, I mean, it shouldn't just be called the global south. It should be called the global majority, because the global majority recognizes Palestine and stands with the Palestinian liberation struggle against Israeli colonialism. This was actually acknowledged blatantly by the financial